few bullet points that we have happened. First, one, to review the Reed-era contract that funds the Civil War Museum through 2023. The funding agreement was passed in 2008 and requires the Harrisburg Regional Visitors Bureau to pay the museum $500,000 a year if city hotel tax revenues exceed $160,000. He says $300,000 was funded to the museum last year, $50,000 so far this year. Now we head to Mayor Eric Coppers. Mayor, could you explain to us what exactly you told the Dauphin County Commissioners today?
Yes, thanks, Dave. I asked the Dauphin County Commissioners to freeze that portion of the hotel tax which they give to the Hershey-Harrisburg Regional Visitors Bureau for the purpose of promoting tourism in Harrisburg. I asked them to do that. They have that power under the hotel tax ordinance to review all expenditures by the Visitors Bureau. And I asked them to do that because the overwhelming majority of the money that goes to them is actually being diverted and has been historically to the National Civil War Museum and not used to truly promote tourism within the city.
Can you explain why this is a failed experiment, especially under this Reed-era contract?
We've spent millions of dollars collectively as a community on the Civil War Museum. Every time somebody pays for parking in the city of Harrisburg, you're essentially paying for that failed experiment. It's not only been to build the building, but it's also been to acquire the collections, to pay the health care and the staffing of employees. It's now diverting our tourism tax dollars, millions and millions of dollars. The city owns the building, the city owns the artifacts, the city needs to reclaim those assets and reposition them for the benefit of a larger number of people.
And I understand you've been trying to negotiate with the museum directly. This is kind of a last-ditch effort for you.
They need this money to survive. They're literally using this money to keep the lights on at the museum and pay their operating expenses. That's wrong. That's not how it was intended. Originally, when the museum was conceived, the goal was to make it self-sufficient. The goal was to have it pay rent to the city of Harrisburg. The fair market value in terms of rent for what the museum should be paying Harrisburg is $636,000 a year. They pay us $1, and we're responsible for all the maintenance and all the other costs associated with the museum. Thanks. So let me take a moment and I'll walk you through this hotel tax because it's a little confusing. We have a 5% tax which people pay when they stay in a hotel in Dauphin County. Each percentage of that tax goes to a different place. The first 2% that is collected is split, and it's split 70% goes to Derry Township for the sports facility there. 20% goes to the city of Harrisburg for tourism and marketing. We actually use that to help pay the bonds for the Harrisburg Senators. And 10% goes to the Dauphin County Economic Development Corporation to generally promote tourism. That's that first 2%. The next single percentage point, the third percentage point, goes to Dauphin County, and the commissioners have great discretion on how they can award that money. Just this year, they've awarded hundreds of thousands of dollars in grants to a whole variety of organizations, including the National Civil War Museum, which got $50,000 and has historically gotten additional money from that discretionary pot, that 1%. They do lots of worthwhile causes, everything from the City Islanders to Jump Street. I've got a list of some of the awards that were made in the packet here. Then there is the last 2%, this additional 2% that was added on a few years ago. Of that 2%, half goes to the Hershey-Harrisburg Regional Visitors Bureau to promote tourism for the county as a whole. And then the other half is split 75% for Derry Township and 25% to promote tourism within the city of the third class in Dauphin County, which is Harrisburg, to promote tourism within Harrisburg. It's that 1/4 of that last 2% of the tax that we're talking about. How much money is that? Well, in 2013, that total amount was about $500,000, and it depends on how many people are staying in hotels and whatnot. And of that $500,000 last year, that's where almost $300,000 went to the Civil War Museum, leaving only about $200,000, not a whole lot, to help promote tourism directly within the city of Harrisburg. And it's a portion of that money that we used in the first months of this year to help do the Summer in the City campaign and other partnerships with HHRVB. We've worked with them for the last 6 months trying to negotiate a new tourism promotion agreement, one that would step down the payments to the Civil War Museum over time. The Civil War Museum's position is they're entitled to the money, they can't live without it, which sort of belies the argument that they're using it for tourism, and there was no room for any negotiation. So despite the city and the Visitors Bureau, I think, being able to reach agreement, we didn't have a partner in the Civil War Museum. Why do we have this agreement? Well, in 2008, which is right after the county extended this additional 2% for the hotel tax, the city entered into an agreement with Hershey Harrisburg over how to spend the money. And the agreement was that you'd form a committee and it would establish a long-term tourism promotion plan for the city. And that in theory is a good idea. But appended to that agreement was a second agreement between the Visitors Bureau and the Civil War Museum, which said the majority of the money is actually going to go to the Civil War Museum. And then that agreement was extended in the waning days of the Reed administration in late October of 2009, after the election, after he already knows it's over, for even more years, all the way out until 2023, literally hamstringing future administrations, Thompson and us, from being able to change that agreement. Curiously, you have Randy King, who was the mayor's chief of staff, basically signing on behalf of the Visitors Bureau for both of those agreements. So you have him signing along with the mayor for the agreement with the Visitors Bureau, and him signing along with the Civil War Museum. Also in the packet, you'll see Steve Reed's notes himself, handwritten notes on the agreement with the Civil War Museum, which indicates that it was basically an agreement that was drafted by the city and that Hershey Harrisburg felt compelled to sign. No, and of course it didn't have city council support. So the backstory on this is the city council had already made it clear that they were not going to authorize any more money going to the National Civil War Museum. There was a whole debate that raged in 2006 and 2007 and 2008 in which city council said, we are not going to take that money that comes to the city directly, the part from the original 2% of the tax, and we're not going to continue sending that to the Civil War Museum, which was done for years. They cut that off, and when they cut that off, essentially Reed created this runaround of city council to make it possible to continue the payments to the Civil War Museum, even though he knew that city council disapproved. And that's an example of a lot of different runarounds that we've uncovered over time. The issue is, and I also include a map, and I think this is a relevant point, the museum isn't even built within the city limits of Harrisburg. Yes, it's owned by Harrisburg, but it's hard to argue that it is helping promote tourism in the city of Harrisburg when it's only measuring admission and tickets into a facility and into a building which is actually built in Susquehanna Township. They don't keep track of any connectivity between that museum and the city, how many hotel nights it's creating within the city of Harrisburg. There's no data. In fact, you can go to the museum and not even enter the city of Harrisburg, depending on how you're going there, or how you're trying to visit it. It's not the best use of the city's limited resources and tourism dollars, and it could be a huge asset. It is an asset that we all own. The city took on general obligation debt to build that museum. The city spent millions of dollars in taxpayer money on artifacts for that museum. When the city collapsed and couldn't financially continue to pay its bills, it was in part due to the millions that had been spent on that museum. We are all suffering from that cost, and to continue to pay for that with another $1 million guaranteed all the way out till 2023 is absolutely not what should be in what is the fiduciary responsibility of the city and the county commissioners in those tourism dollars. The county commissioners, by the hotel ordinance, have the ability to approve or disapprove of how the money is spent by the Hershey-Harrisburg Regional Visitors Bureau. So they can weigh in. And that's why I went to their meeting this morning. I asked them to exercise that oversight, which only they can do. They said they were going to look into it. I did not get the sense that they were necessarily aware of the arrangement. Maybe they have been, maybe they haven't. Remember, this was a separate side agreement. They knew that the money was going to Hershey-Harrisburg. Did they know that Hershey-Harrisburg had pledged, and a long-term pledge, to send the majority of that money out to the Civil War Museum? The Civil War Museum essentially could be in any city in the United States. All of its marketing is about bringing people to an experience which really has no connection to Harrisburg. I don't think you'll find any support for it in our neighborhoods, within the community at large. It's basically a failed experiment, and it's time to cut our losses and begin the process of reclaiming that asset. If we could find a tenant, a conference center, a resort, somebody who'd like to come in and rent that, as I said, the fair market value for that building, and I included this in your packet as well, according to the financial statements of the museum itself, is $633,000 a year. Now, they don't count that as a contribution on their books, but that's how much they should be paying, and instead they're paying $1, and as I mentioned, we have all sorts of other costs associated with that. The artifacts, if we could sell the artifacts, we're talking about millions of dollars in artifacts that the city could use to pave streets, to replace streetlights, to do all those things that everybody wants us to do. And we can do all that and actually have a more productive asset up there in Reservoir Park.
You'd like to sell it altogether?
I think it's time to end what is a failed experiment and to reclaim those assets and redeploy them. The city could relocate part of its city services to...
Was playing or talked about it. Could you bring it up maybe back in a way or something that building could even be used for city hall?
It could. It could be used for a variety of things. It could be used for the city archives. It could be used for a portion of city services. There's ample free parking that we paid millions and millions of dollars for, just the parking alone. By the way, all that money that was spent on the parking went into the Harrisburg Authority and was used to buy Wild West artifacts. That's a separate story about how that was created. But there are a lot of uses for that building, and I think if you saw it being productively used, you would end up bringing a lot more people into the city. I think it's also fair to say that the attendance has declined over time. It is not going to ever, I would say, get bigger or more than it was for the Sesquicentennial at the Battle of Gettysburg. That's already passed. There is no financial long-term plan, let alone a tourism plan that the museum has presented which makes any sense. It's not sustainable. It never was. It shouldn't have been put where it was, if it should have ever been done at all. And it really is a sort of monument, I would say, to the corruption which led us into the financial abyss. So it's time to reclaim the hill. And you can consider this the opening volley in a series of actions that we have planned. But this one needed to get started, and we want the commissioners as a partner. I should also say we support the Hershey-Harrisburg Regional Visitors Bureau. We're not asking for the money not to go to the Hershey-Harrisburg Regional Visitors Bureau. They've been great partners with the city. We know they could help us with marketing. We don't have the capacity to do all that ourselves. We just want that money deployed in a way that makes sense, which is a long-term strategic plan over time. We could do amazing things for the city with that money. I think the Hershey-Harrisburg Visitor Bureau's position is they sort of got stuck with this and they don't know how to get out. And I think the only way out at this point is to have the county commissioners weigh in and exercise their oversight authority.
How much of the, I guess, the Civil War Museum, the funding or the funding that we received goes to inflated salaries with the CEO, the staff, and the board?
They had a fair, I don't have the exact information before me, but a lot of it goes to salary, a lot of it goes to upkeep and utilities. All of that, I think you could question whether or not that's the best use of that money. And frankly, to the extent that they rent out the facility and they can bring in money by hosting functions, the city could do all that. Again, we own the building, we own the artifacts. Only in Harrisburg would all that be controlled by a sort of non-elected, appointed board of individuals really that don't represent the city.
Okay,
Yes. We haven't spoken to Susquehanna Township. I was just making the point that the city does have other buildings, properties that it owns outside of the city limits. For instance, we own a portion of the Greenbelt, which, so that's not necessarily unusual in and of itself. I think it is very odd that the building wasn't built in Harrisburg. The parking lot is in Harrisburg, but the actual structure itself is in Susquehanna Township. Were we to, say, convert that to city offices or something, I think we would want to have a conversation with Susquehanna Township about having that land perhaps deeded and incorporated into the city limits.
What prevents the city from charging rent now?
So there's another contract, which is the lease agreement between the city and the Civil War Museum. That's not in your packet. That contract also was extended for a ridiculous amount of time in the last hours of the Reid administration. It was extended all the way out to 2039, still with the $1 a month rent. So we would question the validity of that contract as well. That amendment that was made, especially in the last hour, but it is currently contractual. Yeah.
As far as Neil Grover's concerned, do you think you can get out of this contract?
I think one step at a time. I think that the board of the Civil War Museum ought to recognize that it doesn't have a plan for the future. There is no viable solution for how this museum is going to be successful in the future. That the city needs those assets. The city has a use for those assets and ought to be able to redeploy them. And I think they ought to just simply hand the keys back over to the city. You should figure out who is on that board. It is a mystery. There's not that much connection. There's not that much connection to the city of Harrisburg. City residents aren't on the board. It's mostly outside business interests. And there are a lot of ways in which all that type of philanthropy that has also gone to the museum could be redirected in ways that would much greater benefit the city.
They're not even eligible to.
Sure. Thank you. That's all right. Last but not least.
I was going to ask about the federal grants. I mean, they can't even accept federal grants because it's a city.
Right. So I guess they have complained publicly if they only owned all the assets, they could then go out and borrow money against them. But isn't that the whole point? They don't own the assets. They don't own the building. If there was a benefactor out there, somebody who was interested in the Civil War, maybe the Smithsonian wanted to come in and purchase the collection and keep the museum going, fine. I think we would consider selling the collection as a whole if the city could recoup those dollars. And I think we would consider continuing to lease the facility if we could get something approaching that $633,000 a year actual value. But right now, $1 a year and we pay everything else is just not fiscally viable. It's not in the city's best interest, and it wasn't. This was done secretively and without public oversight. I think it is a money pit, yes. Yeah.
Walk through that again. You said we pay everything else. What are the expenses the city also bears at Civil War Museum?
Well, a lot of those expenses are contested, but issues with utilities, leaks in the building. There's a whole series of things that the city's been billed for over the years, maintenance-related costs. Yes, and the city also, has to pay to snow shovel and plow the lots and to keep the grass clean, and that's that. I wasn't even talking about that, but I mean just the actual maintenance on the building is a lot. This is a 65,000 square foot building. This is a huge deal.
Are those maintenance costs billed? Are they in this current budget for this year, for example?
No. But the Civil War Museum has tried to invoice us for some of those costs. The city does have to pick up the tab for the public works costs associated with that. Another, the museum also owes money to Capital Region Water. The Capital Region Water guaranteed a $500,000 line of credit for the museum, which the museum has never paid back, has no ability to pay back. Yeah, as the former Harrisburg Authority. Basically, they were allowed to spend $500,000 and basically charge that to utility ratepayers. That's something that Capital Region Water ought to look to recoup, and that can all be settled in some sort of a shaking out of what assets are there.
So there's another thing I'm confused about with the HHRVB. In this packet you gave us, it talks about, it looks like they extended a 5-year promotional plan right as Reid was leaving office,
right,
which would be still ongoing if that had actually been signed or agreed to.
There was no promotion there. I could show you a copy of the supposed promotional plan, which was, basically a page of not very informative things. I think under the Thompson administration, very little cooperation was even attempted with HHRVB, and I think they spent the money without any input from the city. I think the tourism promotion agreement in this committee basically didn't exist. So when I came to office, we met with HHRVB, we reconstituted the committee, we began to have all these conversations, but we had a sort of unresolvable issue, which was that we could do all this, but it wasn't going to touch the majority of the money that was going to the Civil War Museum, because HHRVB's position was they were stuck with this contract that they had signed in 2009. The only way I can see around that is by going to the commissioners directly, and that's what we did this morning. But we gave the Civil War Museum every opportunity to participate, and their position is they're entitled to the money, they don't need to participate, and that's just wrong. Wayne Motz, who's the CEO, several of the board members, since January this year. So we gave it 6 months, and we also used those 6 months to show what we could accomplish if we had a tourism promotion agreement with HHRVB. We put together a really impressive and exciting marketing plan with just a small bit of money for just the beginning of the year. And if the city had access to all that money and HHRV was deploying it in a lot of different ways, we could do tremendous things.
Is the city the biggest funding factor? I mean, I'm sure they get money for ticket sales and merchandise and all that stuff, but I can't. I
think the majority comes from grants, subsidies, and it looks like the majority comes from the county. Yeah, through this and other things. Yeah, and philanthropy. I don't think the majority at all comes from ticket sales. They draw fewer people per year than we have customers at the Midtown Scholar bookstore or other businesses. It is a paltry number of people that actually go to that museum.
What's that financed public?
We can release whatever financial information we have. They have a reporting requirement to the city. Happy to see. Yeah. A little more than $1 million. So, and between the 300,000 or so from here and the other 50, so we're looking at a third of that coming from the county, just in the tourism alone. And so, the opening salvo here is to sort of follow the money and to look to cut off certain funding sources to the museum, and that's what we've done today. That should bring them back to the table, and then we can have a larger, long-term conversation about the museum's future.
What do you think about the Fire Museum?
The Fire Museum's totally different. The Fire Museum's not subsidized by the city and hasn't had a long history of being subsidized by the city. Yep.
Okay. I'm just curious, I mean, so the Civil War Museum obviously has its own press office, keeps doing releases. They just released in early July, or mid-July, July 8th, that they had hired a new education director, said there are more demands for use of the museum. I mean, are you just outright contesting their claims?
I think they're highly subsidized, and I think the money would be better spent on other things. I think it's taxpayer dollars. I think the public has a right to weigh in. I don't think you're going to find any support for the National Civil War Museum among the residents of the city of Harrisburg.
And then so let's say because of this, you're able to get them to freeze the dollars, the Civil War Museum closes, sell off all the artifacts, close the museum. That total tourism dollars that is supposed to be spent on the city, what are they going to be spent on? Can they be spent on things like potholes, or do they have to be used?
Well, for starters, the money that goes to HHRVB would now be freed up. So you'd have $500,000 a year that could be spent promoting the city of Harrisburg. That's big and exciting. That could be used to promote specific festivals like Capona, like others like the 4th of July. It could be used to develop a marketing plan. It can be used for all sorts of things. But the city and HHRVB would form a working committee, and we'd plot a 5-year strategy, something similar. And we'd enter into an actual tourism promotion agreement on how to do that. But under that scenario, we'd probably have millions of dollars worth of revenue coming into the city from the sale of the artifacts. And if we were able to lease the space at something close to market rate, we'd have over another $500,000 a year coming back to the city in terms of income. And all of those proceeds could go easily for potholes and other priorities that the city would have. And it has been millions and millions and millions of dollars of subsidy over what has now been more than a decade. And I say it's time to end the failed experiment.
Did you contact former Mayor Reed about this at all in the 6 months since you got in here, about the history of this?
I've not had. I've only had the most brief passing conversation with Mayor Reed since I've become mayor. I think we exchanged pleasantries at a wedding. That's it. Pleasantries. Said hello, and I think he might have said something like, "You're doing a good job," and I smiled and said, "Thank you." That was it.